Welcome to this month's service in Newburn Parish. Before I speak, Jamie is going to read for us.
Our reading today is from John's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me.
The reading that we've just heard fits with much of what we think about in Lent. It's about life and death, and it's also about smells. I wonder what your favourite smell is. I love the smell of bleach. It just makes me think that the house is really clean whenever I smell it. Mary pouring the perfume on Jesus' feet makes the house full of the smell of perfume. It was how a body was prepared for burial. So these events look ahead to the death of Jesus, and in particular to his Last Supper with his disciples. And they also look back to the moment when Jesus raised Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus from the dead, when the sisters were worried about the smell because the body had been there for 4 days. So the house was filled with a good smell. Mary's act was fragrant as well as flagrant. Then she began to wipe Jesus' feet with her hair. So what's the significance of this? Jewish women of this time usually wore their hair tied up in public. There would have been only 2 occasions where their hair would have been loose like this: when undressing for her husband or as a sign of distraction in mourning. So Mary's action showed both that she loved Jesus and that she was soon to be mourning his death. And this reading is particularly relevant for Lent because it looks forward to the Last Supper. Both of these events involve a meal. Both involve wiping feet. Mary wiped Jesus' feet with her hair, while Jesus wiped his disciples' feet with his hands and a towel. And both events look forward to Jesus' death. Here, Mary anoints Jesus at the Last Supper. Jesus tried to explain his death to his disciples, although as usual, they struggled to understand. And another link is that Judas tried to ruin God's work on both occasions. After the Last Supper, of course, he went off to betray Jesus. Here, he criticises Mary. You might say he caused a stink. We heard in the reading where it said, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. But Jesus doesn't accept Judas's complaint. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Jesus is telling Judas to let it go. Mary's right and you're wrong. Mary is devoted and Judas is dishonest. Although it might seem that Mary was wasteful, it's her who Jesus praises. So what should we take from this passage? Mary's extravagant act mirrors the extravagance of God's love. And if you want to know how extravagant God's love is, just take a look at the story of the prodigal son for one example, and we were looking at that last week in our Sunday evening service. He is a God who doesn't know when to stop. His love knows no limits. The pouring out of Jesus' own life on the cross for the whole world will also be an extravagant act of love. Secondly, this passage doesn't tell us to forget about the poor. Martha's right to feed the empty mouths around her. That's the church's calling in every generation. But only being active will lead us to becoming exhausted. If we don't appreciate the extraordinary generosity of God's love, we will get exhausted. The world, not to mention the church, would have a difficult time running itself without any Marthas. But without the flagrant and fragrant offerings of the Marys, the church runs the risk of being nothing more than a doer of good works. And we can only be effective in our good works if we're dependent on the grace of Jesus. That's why the first of the 10 commandments is to love God and the second is to love our neighbour. Because it's only when we appreciate just how much God has given us by forgiving our sins that we're able to appreciate that our neighbour is a fellow sinner just like us and worthy of all the love and compassion that we can give them. So as we prepare to observe Christ's coming passion and death during Holy Week, maybe we should ask ourselves, what kinds of service does God want of us? Where have we been stingy and where has God been extravagant? How do we use what God has so generously given us in ways that are truly acts of devotion as well as service? Have we worried too much about holding on to the things that are precious to us? Have we withheld gifts that might have given both God and us true pleasure in the giving? Lots of questions, I know, but one final question. How might we make ourselves a flagrant and fragrant offering to God? C.S. Lewis once wrote, "The allegorical sense of Mary's great action dawned on me the other day. The precious alabaster box which one must break over the holy feet is one's heart. Easier said than done, and the contents become perfume only when it is broken. While they are safe inside, they are more like sewage." Thinking of things that we don't put to use as sewage might seem a bit harsh. We may think that we have little or nothing anyway, so what can we give to Jesus? But the good news is that when we do open our heart to give Jesus all that we have, we find just how much more he has to give us. He can take our offerings that seem so limited to us and make them like the jar of perfume, filling the church and the community with a sweet fragrance. We sometimes sing, "May the fragrance of Jesus fill this place." And of course, we don't mean that literally. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we opened our hearts to God so much that everyone who came into our church became overwhelmed with the presence of Jesus and they knew just how much he loved them?
May the fragrance of Jesus fill this place. May the fragrance of Jesus fill this place. Rising from the sacrifice of lives laid down in adoration. May beauty of Jesus fill my life.
May the beauty of Jesus